Deep beneath the surface of West Virginia, a group of adventurers embark on a journey into the unknown. They were drawn to Friar's Hole, a place where icy waters rush through tight passages and towering underground waterfalls block the exit. But what started as an exciting exploration quickly turned into a fight for survival. One caver, inexperienced and unprepared, faced a terrifying fall into darkness, swallowed by the icy grip of an underground pool. The cave tested them with every step, its treacherous beauty hiding danger at every turn. Would they make it out, or would the cave claim another victim? Located in the scenic Greenbrier and Pocahontas counties of West Virginia lies the Friars Hole cave system, one of the most fascinating and longest cave networks in the United States and the world. First explored in the 1960s, this underground marvel stretches over 75 kilometers, making it the longest cave in the Appalachian Highlands. With its intricate passages, hidden streams, and fascinating history, Friars Hole is a natural wonder waiting to be discovered. Friars Hole isn't just one cave. It is a vast system with 11 entrances, including well-known ones like Friars Hole, Icebox Cave, and Snedegar's Cave. Some of these entrances are open to exploration, while others remain closed or on private property. The cave formed millions of years ago in the Mississippian Greenbrier limestone, shaped by streams that carve their way through the rock. Over time, shifting drainage patterns and natural forces expanded the system, creating the sprawling underground labyrinth we see today. This cave has a rich history. During the Civil War, saltpeter was mined near the Snedegar's entrance. Exploration of the system began in earnest in the 1960s, and by 1976, several smaller caves were connected, forming the Friars Hole cave system. Today, it's listed as one of the most significant caves in the world for its biology, geology, and hydrology. One remarkable feature is the Icebox Cave entrance. It sits in a steep-sided sinkhole and offers access to dry passages leading to a massive underground stream called the Friars Hole Trunk. This passage is 65 feet wide and 15 feet tall. From here, explorers can venture north toward the main cave system or south to the furthest reaches of Friars Hole. The surrounding property, managed by the West Virginia Cave Conservancy, or WVCC, includes a mix of young hardwood forests and sinkholes with small streams feeding into the caves. The land is preserved in its natural state to protect the fragile ecosystem both above and below ground. In recent years, the WVCC has worked to maintain access to some entrances, such as Icebox Cave, while ensuring the safety of explorers. However, due to unstable conditions in parts of the cave, some areas are no longer safe to enter. Exploring Friars Hole is like stepping into another world. Its passages reveal the incredible power of nature, with underground streams flowing for miles and breathtaking rock formations shaped over millions of years. However, this is not a commercial cave, and all entrances are privately owned. Anyone interested in visiting should seek permission and be aware of the cave's fragile and changing environment. Friars Hole cave system remains an active site for exploration, with cavers continuously mapping and discovering new passages. It was the first cave in West Virginia to break 50 miles in length, a milestone reached on December 31, 2021. On a crisp morning on November 13, 1982, a group of 9 adventurous cavers prepared for a thrilling expedition into Friars Hole, a famous and extensive cave system in West Virginia. This wasn't just any caving trip. It was a challenging 6-mile journey through the cave, with the plan to emerge at the Canadian Hole entrance. For most, the excitement of exploring the underground labyrinth outweighed the challenges they might face. But little did they know that their adventure would soon turn into a life-or-death struggle. The group was made up of cavers with different amounts of experience. The leader and one other person were very experienced explorers who had been through Friars Hole before. The others were a mix of cavers, with some having experience and others being beginners who were excited to show what they could do. Everyone was excited as they checked their equipment carefully. Some had headlamps and helmets, while others only had carbide lamps, which are old-fashioned but can easily stop working if they don't have backups. Not everyone was equally ready. While the leader and one other person wore wetsuits to stay warm in the cold, most of the group just wore normal clothes and layers. Some decided not to bring all of their climbing equipment, choosing lighter gear to carry less weight. One caver brought prusiks, which is a simple tool for climbing ropes, but they had never actually used them. Well, even though they weren't all perfectly prepared, everyone was nevertheless in a good mood as they went into the cave, excited to explore its big rooms, narrow tunnels, and flowing underground streams. The beginning of the trip was breathtaking and filled with excitement. The group entered the dark, mysterious cave, and they moved through narrow tunnels filled with cold water. They crawled through tight spaces, walked through large, echoing chambers, and marveled at the beautiful rock formations that had taken millions of years to form. The sound of water dripping from the ceiling echoed all around them, adding to the eerie but magical feeling of being deep underground. The cool, damp air clung to their skin, reminding them of just how far they were from the outside world. For the cavers who had done this before, it felt normal, an exciting but familiar adventure in a place that they had learned to respect. But for those with less experience, it was both exciting and scary. The darkness seemed to get closer as they went deeper, and the feeling of being stuck in a stone maze made their hearts beat fast. Every step took them farther from daylight, and the unknown ahead felt like a challenge that they weren't sure that they could handle. As the group went further in, the cave started to test them. The leaders, who were confident and skilled, moved quickly, easily going through the twists and turns of the cave. They knew the way, and they hardly stopped, their headlamps lighting the path like guiding stars. But the newer cavers had trouble keeping up. The ground became rougher, the passages narrower, and the water colder. Their legs started to hurt, and they started to breathe harder. Some of them slipped on the wet rocks, and others hesitated at narrow spaces that seemed impossible to get through. After many hours of walking through the winding tunnels and dark chambers, the group finally arrived at the most dangerous part of the cave, the way out. To leave, they would have to climb a series of steep, straight-up drops. These weren't easy climbs. They were slippery walls with water rushing down them like waterfalls. The drops were 12 feet, 24 feet, 8 feet, 15 feet, and a final, very big 35-foot drop. The loud sound of the rushing water echoed everywhere, and the air was freezing cold from the spray. Now, before the trip began, the leaders had prepared ropes for the first 3 drops. But the 4th drop, the 15-foot climb, had no safety rope. This meant that anyone climbing it would have to do so without any help from gear, relying only on their hands and feet in order to pull themselves up. The leader went first, quickly climbing the first 2 drops with skill and confidence. The others watched as the leader disappeared into the darkness above them, the sound of the rushing water making it hard to hear anything else. Feeling encouraged by how easily the leader had climbed, 2 more cavers started their climb. The water from the cave's underground streams made the walls extremely slippery. Cold water splashed onto their faces and hands, making them feel very cold. The force of the water pushed against them as they climbed, making it feel like the cave itself was trying to stop them from leaving. Every movement was a struggle to hold on and keep climbing. As the group watched from below, the excitement that they had felt earlier started to change into fear. The drops looked much taller and more dangerous than they had thought they would. The roaring water made the climb seem impossible, and the thought of falling into the freezing pools below filled them with fear. For the first time, they understood how dangerous their adventure really was, and the hardest moments were still to come. One of the group members, who wasn't used to climbing vertical drops, tried to climb the first one using prusiks, which is a type of climbing knot. The climb started off shaky, but the caver pushed on, determined to keep up. But about 6 feet above the freezing pool of water below, everything went wrong. The caver accidentally moved directly under the rushing waterfall. The cold, powerful stream of water hit him like a punch, soaking him completely and extinguishing his carbide lamp. Suddenly, he was in complete darkness. Disoriented and unable to see, the caver lost his grip. The prusik slipped, and he fell back into the icy pool below with a loud splash. The freezing water hit him like a shockwave. His body seized up as the cold seeped through his wet clothes, draining his strength. Gasping for air, the caver tried to stay calm, but panic began to take over. The roar of the waterfall made it impossible to hear clearly, and the dark, enclosed space of the cave felt suffocating. The rest of the group quickly realized that something was wrong. Shouting over the noise, they worked together to pull the fallen caver out of the water. Luckily, the caver was small and light, so they managed to haul him up. When they finally got the caver to safety, it was very clear that he was in a bad situation. His teeth were chattering, his hands were shaking, and he looked pale and weak. The group decided to continue moving, hoping to get everyone up out of the cave as fast as they could. But the caver who was hurt was already very tired. The freezing water had used up all of his energy, and each step became even more difficult. He moved slowly and awkwardly, and the cold kept getting deeper into his body. At the second drop, 4 cavers who were still feeling okay managed to climb up and pull the struggling caver and another very tired member to the top. But by the time they got to the third drop, the situation was very serious. The injured caver was doing even worse. He was now shaking uncontrollably and couldn't move well at all. He was now suffering severely from hypothermia, and the other cavers were almost completely out of energy. The team had to get creative to navigate the third drop. They formed a 3-person shoulder stand to help the victim climb. Every movement was a struggle, and the narrow, wet passageways added to the sense of claustrophobia. The sound of rushing water filled the air, and the cold seemed to seep into everyone's bones. When they arrived at the 4th drop, the team realized that they had no other choices. Climbing without ropes was just too risky for the injured caver in his weak condition. It was obvious that they needed another rope to get them up safely. The leader, showing great strength and quick thinking, left the cave to go get a rope and more equipment. The leader came back 45 minutes later with a rope and a warm-down vest for the injured caver. By then, the injured caver was barely able to respond, and his body was shaking uncontrollably. The team tied the new rope securely and then used it to help lift the injured caver up the 15-foot climb. Every second felt extremely long as the team worked together to make sure that their friend was safe. Finally, they reached the last challenge, the 35-foot entrance pit. By this point, the injured caver was too weak to climb at all. A team of 6 people waiting outside, who had been contacted earlier by the leader, worked together to pull the injured caver to safety. The rescuers looked very focused as they worked together, pulling steadily until the injured caver was finally out of the cave. Once everyone was out of the cave, the injured caver was wrapped in a space blanket and given hot drinks to help him recover from hypothermia. The other cavers, even though they were very tired and shaken up, were relieved to have survived. The adventure that had begun with so much excitement had become a strong reminder of the dangers of caving. The events of the trip highlighted important lessons about preparation and safety in caving. Some explorers pointed out that the group would have handled the waterfalls better if they had moved at a slower pace and stayed together. The victim's struggle was caused by several factors: their lack of caving experience, wearing unsuitable clothing for climbing through waterfalls, not knowing how to use knots on a wet rope, and becoming overly tired from trying to keep up with the faster members of the group. The group was unprepared for the challenges of the waterfalls. Their climbing equipment was different for each person, and some cavers didn't know how their gear would work in wet conditions. Many didn't have good headlamps, and those using carbide lamps faced problems because muddy cave water clogged the devices. Few had wetsuits, which would have helped protect them from the cold water and made the climbing safer. But one of the biggest mistakes was not planning for the waterfalls properly. If the group had entered through the Canadian hole and then rigged the ropes away from the water flow, they could have avoided much of the danger. Instead, they faced a difficult choice: attempt the dangerous exit climbs or retreat 6 miles back through the cave, which would have been exhausting and time-consuming. This story reminds us that when taking inexperienced cavers on a trip, their safety depends on the leader's decisions. Beginners often don't understand the risks or know how to prepare for the challenges ahead. If time allows, it is always better to give everyone a chance to practice and improve on their gear before tackling the hardest parts of the cave. With better preparation, teamwork, and caution, the group could have avoided many of the dangers that they faced that day.
On a snowy day back in 1995, 3 college students from Tennessee begged their professor to tag along on a cave mapping expedition in Saltpeter Cave. They were novice cavers, but he agreed. Ignoring the warnings, they ventured into the cave on their own a day before they were supposed to. Together, they faced unimaginable horrors and gruesome injuries. Nearly 20 years later, the survivors and rescuers met for a reunion, and the rescuers couldn't believe the shocking tale the cavers told them. Just like them, you're about to relive it all. This is the grisly story of the Saltpeter Cave rescue. Brothers for life, but blind to danger. Dr. Kurt Wise was teaching at a university in Tennessee. He was planning an expedition to Saltpeter Cave, where he would map uncharted passages of the cave's winding tunnels. He needed some backup for safety, and 3 of his students jumped at the chance. Nate Lorenzo and Matt Gore grew up together in Florida, and they both vowed to remain friends even after high school, when so many friendships typically fall apart. They both got accepted into the same college in Tennessee and enrolled in a class taught by Dr. Wise. There, they met the 3rd student joining them for this story, Jake Minton. Saltpeter Cave was once a very challenging cave, with just enough interesting formations to attract cavers from all around the U.S. The entrance area was expansive and easy to traverse, so teens would often go to the cave for parties, which turned it into the most vandalized cave in the state of Tennessee. Following the shocking events of this story and many others like it, Saltpeter was closed to the public. Dr. Wise had planned for a Saturday venture into Saltpeter Cave, but on the day before the expedition, the 3 young men had different plans. They wanted to travel through part of the cave on their own ahead of time. Wise immediately knew this was a terrible idea and begged them not to go. He explained that mapping expeditions are not like regular cave outings. Saturday's trip would be very difficult, and the portion they wanted to explore was also tough. They could easily fail that section on their own or run out of steam midway through Saturday's exploration. Wise tried to reason with them. Why risk their lives? If they wanted a career in caving and a degree to help them along that path, then they should play it smart, because none of that matters to a pile of bones. Matt, Nate, and Jake were too impatient. Wise eventually realized he couldn't persuade them. They were adults, and they were going to do what they wanted, even if it put them in extreme danger. He gave them some advice and told them to take some vital life-saving supplies: chafing fuel or canned heat, thermo blankets, and more light sources. This advice would be one of the most important parts of their journey, fighting to survive Saltpeter Cave. They were all in good spirits walking into Saltpeter Cave. They made it to the cave's first feature, the prayer room. A strange coincidence, since Jake was a devout believer in God. But then they started to notice something was off. Nate's headlamp started to flicker, then Jake's. They took off the straps and whacked the side of the light, like people do with remotes out of habit. Sometimes the batteries dislodge, so the technique can actually work. But even if that was the problem, this wasn't a small inconvenience. If their lamps were malfunctioning during a difficult climb or descent, they could easily slip. Or worse. They pressed on, ignoring their second warning. But the flickering of the lights got worse. and soon one of their lights went out. Moisture from the cave could have been seeping into the light's electronics, or maybe they weren't constructed properly. That's yet another warning. They shouldn't have bought cheap knockoffs for things their lives depended on. You wouldn't want a discount airbag in your car or a thrift store parachute, so why skimp on your only way to sea deep below ground? One by one, each of their lights started turning off. They paused, considering what to do. At this point, they were already in a disaster, but they didn't realize the gravity of their situation. Instead of turning around, they kept crawling along in the darkness, bumping into rock forms, and gingerly putting their hands in front of them to avoid going face first into a wall. Even though they didn't turn around, walking in pitch-black darkness did make them quake with terror. It was also slowing them down considerably. Time is a factor many novice cavers don't think about too much. It's hard to know how long a task will take if you've never done it before, and relying on experiences from past beginner caves isn't a great idea either. They didn't know just how bad time can really be when you're stuck in a claustrophobic nightmare. Their lights stayed off for random intervals up to 15 minutes before they would hauntingly flicker back to life, taunting Matt, Nate, and Jake as they kept pushing their luck. If this group of Tennessee college students kept exploring the cave despite their gear failing, well, the cave must have been a cakewalk, right? Far from it. Saltpeter Cave was pushing them to their limits, physically and mentally. Eventually, they trudged into the waterfall room, a close-quarters tube of rock with a small cliff looking out over the waterfall and the rest of the room that extended down to a small stretch of dry floor with other passages reaching into the unknown darkness. They paused and looked at the water's ghostly glow in their lights, marveling at the beauty of the cave they had all but overcome on their own. Disaster and miracles in the waterfall room. Matt nodded, standing triumphantly on the cliff, and wiped sweat and mud from his brow. It had all been worth it. That's when they heard sounds. The quick snap of stone, the tumble of rock against rock, and the dusty rush of dirt kicking into the air. Matt had no time to react. The shelf he was standing on was breaking apart. His solid footing and his body suddenly vanished as dust and rubble engulfed him. The cliff looked very far down, too far down. The ledge Matt was standing on was 60 feet tall, over 5.5 stories. It was like Matt had just fallen from the equivalent of a small apartment complex with no awnings, no branches, no bushes, not even the completely soft dirt to catch his fall. Just dense, impenetrable stone. Jake and Nate looked down in horror. As the dust started to settle, they pointed their flickering lights around the room and saw blood sprayed across the walls of the cave. Jake turned around in shock, not wanting to see the damage shrouded by the dust. Nate called down, asking if Matt was all right. No response. Matt looked like a goner. The sight was worse than they could have imagined. Matt's head had bounced off the cave floor, creating a compound fracture in his skull. His hair had torn away, revealing part of his skull beneath a stream of blood. Standing there in pure shock and silence so total and complete, it was like hearing death itself whispering in their ears. Nate and Jake heard a groan, then hoarse breathing. The pair rushed down to Matt. They didn't even think about the structural integrity of the rest of the rock. They had to get to their friend. They got to him and saw his eyes were open, but he was looking past them and moaning in pain. His eyes were black from so many blood vessels that had burst upon impact. His face was also torn up, and his jaw was slack and slanted, broken. His legs were also misshapen, and his lungs sounded like they were punctured. They reached out to cradle him, but they weren't sure if they should move him. As a rule of thumb, cavers and trauma responders are taught not to move a patient until they have stabilizing gear ready, like a stretcher, splints, neck braces, and straps to prevent any injuries from getting worse. One wrong move could cause frayed nerves in Matt's spine to sever, paralyzing him or instantly killing him. Or they could accidentally cause the exposed bone of his skull to sink down and pierce his brain. The trio made their next costly mistake in a string of poor decisions. They stayed there with him, trying to comfort him and reassure him that he would shake it off and climb out. They were in total shock and disbelief about the grim reality playing out before their very eyes. Their voice shook as they talked to him, but Matt was teetering in and out of consciousness. At any moment, he could fall into an irreversible coma or leave this world behind forever. That's when Nate and Jake finally wised up. Nate handed Jake all the lights he had left. He was going to stay behind with his lifelong friend and support him as best as he could. The coldness of the cave was also an issue now. The waterfall room's flowing foam and mist filled the air with cold moisture that began to pool on Matt's exposed flesh and bone. Cavers aren't meant to linger in this room for long, and movement is needed to keep the body warm. The thin candle of Matt's life was burning at both ends as his injuries and the elements threatened to snuff his lights out. To help combat these dangers, Jake gave them the thermal blanket. The only thermal blanket. Despite all of the warnings from the aptly named Dr. Wise, the group only brought one thermal blanket. But, miraculously, it seemed like it was enough. Nate popped open the canned heat and sat them on the bloody ground next to Matt before shaking out the blanket and draping it over him, carefully making sure heat didn't escape from one side. Then, Jake got as close to Matt as he could without risking injury, and pressed the blanket around himself to seal in the warmth and keep them both safe from the cold. For now, Nate rolled around and propped himself up on his elbows to light 2 tea lights, small disc candles in little tins to keep them lit. He lit one for each of them. That way, hopefully, the void wouldn't swallow them up again if a single candle burned out. The fragile light was nearly drenched when Matt started puking in the thermal blanket. In spite of all the incomprehensible nightmares they were faced with, Nate had faith in a higher power, and he felt certain they would all make it out alive. He stayed by his friend's side through it all. He couldn't leave the blanket, or he'd risk his own life, and he was the only one who could help Matt right now. Meanwhile, Jake wasn't feeling as confident. He was panicking as he rushed through the challenging cave, and he kept getting lost. After he spent an uncomfortable length of time navigating the cave alone with messed up lights while Matt's life hung in the balance, Jake finally stumbled out of the mouth of Saltpeter Cave. Now, this was the time before cell phones were necessities of life. Jake had to run to the nearest house, but he got there, started frantically pounding on the door looking like an insane person, blurted out the situation, and called for an emergency rescue. The Cumberland County Rescue Squad and the nearby town's fire department rushed to the cave. An ambulance was standing by, ready to burn rubber at a moment's notice. Luckily for the 3 eager cavers, this fire department had trained in cave rescue operations, so their first response rescue team was better equipped than most emergency personnel. Cave rescue teams from all around Tennessee, and even some from nearby states, were all on their way as well. Unlike some rescues, the teams were quickly able to traverse the cave. They had studied it well and practiced there. No obstacles stood in their way. Matt's vision darkened as the cold began to numb his already battered limbs. Nate closed his eyes to pray, and in that very moment, the light of the rescue team beamed across the ceiling of the waterfall room. Rescuers quickly got to work to prepare Matt for his grueling trip out of Saltpeter Cave. One rescuer was tasked with carrying a cable that allowed the rescue cavers to talk to the medics outside the cave. There, standing by, was the lead doctor of the ER of the town's hospital, and he was able to guide the fire and caving crews to give Matt the best chance for survival. Even though the rescuers got to Matt in record time, this wasn't a simple in-and-out rescue. Matt was hanging on by a thread. Everything had to be perfect. Outside, a blizzard started covering the outdoor half of the rescue team, which made things even more complicated. The low zero wind chill could be the final straw for Matt. Rescuers started hammering and drilling anchors into the cave walls to create a pulley to lift Matt out of the waterfall room. Other rescuers brought food, supplies, and warm water into the cave for support. They hoisted Matt slowly and carefully up the side of the broken cliff. The parts of the trip that had challenged them would be extra difficult now. Rescuers had to crawl on their hands and knees, precariously balancing Matt on a stretcher fixed on top of their backs to keep him level. Despite the storm, a helicopter was positioned right outside Saltpeter Cave. Matt's consciousness came to one more time as the snow swirled around him as medics raced to get him to the waiting chopper. Over 12 hours after he fell, Matt was airlifted to the trauma wing of a nearby hospital. In the hours and days after the accident, his condition stabilized. Matt was finally saved. but his recovery was just beginning. In the months and years to come, he had to learn how to walk again, and he needed reconstructive surgery to repair the delicate cartilage and features of his face that had been warped and pulverized by the terrible impact on saltpeter's floor. The reunion and facing demons. Back in 2012, some of the people from this story met up for a reunion. This was the first time the rescuers and the cavers had really met. There wasn't much small talk when Matt was howling for his life, while the others were panicked and the rescuers were in action mode. 12 people showed up from the hundreds that helped save Matt's life. Many of the rescuers had never even heard Matt's story before this reunion. If they even checked the news, they only got snippets. And the news didn't contact them for their side either. They just did their part that day and kept on living life until the next rescue got them out of bed and back into another cave. Their reunion highlighted how it's not just the rescue that changes lives. Sometimes talking about events with the people involved is just as powerful. After all, the rescuers are experts. They do things that normal people could never do. And likewise, newbie cavers do things that experts might not even consider. Getting to know who they're rescuing, what drives them, how they feel, what decisions they make, can all help rescuers save lives in the future. On a personal level, it was probably refreshing for both sides. Rescuers are taught not to get too attached to the cavers they're trying to save. It's not always a lesson explicitly stated in manuals, but it's a lesson they'll be confronted with almost immediately after they sign up for a rescue mission. Rescuers can try their hardest, but at the end of the day, even if they do everything right, life can still slip away. They care deeply. That's why they do it. But if they blame themselves for every life they couldn't save, that guilt would eat them up inside. Many would end up quitting. Some might turn to alcohol and spiral into self-destruction. Some might be haunted for the rest of their lives about the people they saw slip away right before their eyes. But after it's all said and done, meeting the cavers they saved can help remind them that this is what it's all about. Helping people enjoy the world of caving. Giving people a second chance to tell their own stories over their own lives. Of course, it couldn't end there. Matt didn't just recount his experience, he had a new story to tell. After hearing the horrifying extent of Matt's injuries, the rescuers at the reunion sat with mouths open in shock. Some with smirks and disbelief when Matt told them that he, Nate, and Jake had all returned to Saltpeter Cave only 3 months after the ordeal, while Matt's brain was still healing. Matt wanted to face his demons and get closure. He could only make it to the first room of the cave before his nerves got the better of him. But 2 years later, Matt and his new fiancée met up with Nate and went into the breach one last time. Matt made it to the waterfall room. And this time, the new trio all made it out, with the sun shining on them and their heads held high in victory. Now, these three might have made a ton of rookie mistakes, but their determination is simply amazing.